Today, we're going to continue with my story about my Japan life. I told you about what it was like before I even came here and what I was thinking about and why I became interested in Japan and East Asia in general. And today, I'll be telling you about what it was like on my way. What was the road getting here that I took to get here? What that was like. And then in the future episodes, I'll tell you what it was like when I got here in 1968 and what I have been doing here since then and how it has been since then. So to continue with our story about in the past, there I was. I had my interest in Japan and in East Asia, and there was a lot of it. But, I didn't really have an idea that I would ever go there. Having an interest and actually going someplace is a big jump, especially way back then, because I was still a kid, so I couldn't readily get on an airplane. And back in those days, international travel was not as common and not as easy as it is now. There were no jumbo jets or things like that. And people just didn't go out and jump on a plane and go visit someplace because they wanted to see what it looked like. So, though I had Japan and East Asia in my mind, I had no idea of going there. I had no thought that I would ever go there, as a matter of fact. So I grew up in the southwest suburbs of Chicago, and it was a good childhood when I was a kid. There was a lot to do. We had a lot of places to play baseball in the winter. We had a lot of places to go skating and play ice hockey. So it was very active and very enjoyable, and the people there were great, and so it was a great place to grow up. However, as I became older, especially as I reached my teenage years, I got the feeling that got starting to get a little bit boring because it was never changing. Everything every day was basically the same as the previous day, and as we hit our teenage years, my friends seemed to be mostly concerned with, whether they were going to get their next six pack or that girl that just went walking by or this kind of thing or the latest Beatles song or something like that. So it seemed a little bit shallow. It didn't seem very interesting at all. Now, back in those days, I wanted to become, I had the idea that I wanted to become a cop. I wanted to become a policeman. A friend of mine whose older brother was a policeman, got into some Chicago police cadets, and he was he slipped straight into the police department. I don't know how old he was, but he got into the police department at a very early age, and I really envied him, though I didn't have that much of a desire to get into the Chicago police department, basically because it was in Chicago. So I was interested in getting into my little suburban police department. So what I did was I had enrolled in the University of Illinois, and I was scheduled to go into college and to study the administration of criminal justice, which meant that I would study for 4 years or however long it would take and come out and be ready to start my police career. But being young and impatient, I wanted to get the show on the road. Now, there was another thing that was sort of like nagging at me. And though my scholastic scores were good, I didn't have the energy or the passion to go to school. So I was really worried, really concerned about whether I would be able to call up the energy to study for 4 years, to get in the classroom for 4 years and do the coursework that was required to get a degree in the administration of criminal justice. So, but I was going to give it a shot, but I was really wondering about whether I could hack it. I had a girlfriend at that time, and she put a big load on my time. And I know it would have been a problem if I had gone on to college at that time. But anyway, I never ended up going to college at that time. I did later, but because what happened was just before I was scheduled to go into college, I was with a friend of mine, and we were out on, a neighborhood friend, And we were in this coffee shop, and they were they had these big plate glass windows, and we're looking out the windows, drinking our coffee or our Coke or whatever. And there was a Army recruiter across the street, recruiter's office across the street, and it caught our eye. We started talking about it, and that was in the days of Vietnam, and so a lot of people were down on the military, and being baby boomers as we were, it was our specialty to give authority a hard time. I mean, I don't know if it's true of all young people, but I know in my generation, that was a whole generation of smart Alecs and troublemakers who really loved to put the needle into people of authority and grown-ups. So there we were, and we said, yeah, let's go give this guy a hard time. So we went into the office, thinking we were real cool and sassy. We start talking to this guy, and we were purposely asking him questions that we knew were uncomfortable for him to answer, or that he couldn't answer. And as we were going along, though, one thing caught my ear, and that's when he was explaining about why people volunteer. Because in those days, the America still had a draft, and everybody who got drafted had to spend 2 years in the military. But if you volunteered, you spent 3 years. So I said to the guy, why would anybody volunteer for an extra year? And he told me, well, if you enlist, you can choose the job that you do in the Army. If you're drafted, they probably give you a gun, teach you how to shoot, and send you to Vietnam. But if if you volunteer, you get to choose your job. And I said, oh, really? I mean, this got me interested. So I told him, I want to be a cop, and I'm really itching to start now. So I said, are you telling me that if I volunteer and I sign up for 3 years, that you'll let me become a military policeman? And he said, sure, if you qualify. And I said, what do you mean qualify? And he says, well, you have to take a test. So I said, okay, I'll tell you what, I'll take your test. You tell me if I qualify. And if I can become a military policeman, I'll consider enlisting for 3 years. Well, he said, fair enough. So he gave me, he made an appointment for me to take a test and gave me information about where I have to be, when I have to be there, what I have to bring. So I got there, and I went to the place, and it was in downtown Chicago. It was in some old building. And this room, we went to this room, and the room was gigantic. It had really high ceilings with lights hanging down. And it was filled with desks and young men getting ready to take the test. So I went and took my seat. I don't remember if I had an assigned seat or if you just took a seat where you wanted, but mine was somewhere in the middle, surrounded by all these people. And so the test began. So the first thing that struck me about the test was how simple and basic it was. It was basically, they would show a line drawing of some person having a problem. And then they would show a multiple choice answer of how the problem was best resolved, A, B, C, D. And then you would mark it with your pencil on an IBM card. And that's what they would use to score you. And so I don't remember very many of the questions. I do remember one question in particular. It showed this guy with a wheelbarrow full of bricks. And he was trying to take this wheelbarrow over a curb, about this high. And he's sitting there next to the wheelbarrow going like this, with this big question mark coming out of his head. And A showed him pushing the wheelbarrow against the curb. B showed him taking the bricks out and putting them on top of the curb. C showed him pulling the wheelbarrow back against the curb, which of course is the correct answer, in case you didn't know. And there may have been one or two other answers. I don't remember offhand. But a lot of questions like that. I'm going through there, and okay. And to tell you the truth, I've always been a good test taker because I don't worry about it. I go into a test. If I know it, I know it. If I don't know it, I don't know it. And I don't get stressed out about it. So I'm sitting there, beep, 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 finish up. So after we finish up, some guy comes along, collects all the cards, and they take them out. Say, everybody sit here. So we're sitting around talking. Where you from? What are you doing? You going in the Army? Why are you going in the Army? All that kind of stuff. And then this guy comes back, the guy who had collected all the cards, and he calls out my name. And I was shocked. I thought, wow, did I mark something wrong, or something like that? So I go up and he says, okay, come with me. So he takes me down this hallway, dark hallway, to this big wood door, opens the door, and I go in. And there's this military guy there, Army guy. And he's dressed for effect. He's got his stripes, he's had a lot of them. And he had his hash marks marking how many years he's been in the Army. He had his ribbons, of course, and the different badges and awards that he had received. And I go in there and he said, well, you did pretty good on the test there, son. And I said, oh, thank you, And he said, I would like to make an offer to you. How would you like to join the Army Security Agency? So at that time, I didn't know what the Army Security Agency was, but I heard security and I thought, well, maybe it's kind of like a police thing, So I said, well, yeah, but what is the Army Security Agency? And he said, well, I'll tell you what. And he took out this book, and it was pretty thick, and it was very well done, thick pages and glossy photos. And he says, take this book and go into that room there, go through the book, read it, look through it, and when you're through, come on back out. So I said, okay. So I do as told. I go in this room. I'm the only one in this room. Nobody else is there. I'm going through this book. I'm reading it. Okay. There are a lot of pictures of technicians with headphones operating this machinery and stuff like that. Others with guys at a desk with pencils, and they are the analysts, right? And so it was all these different kinds of jobs being done, looked very technical. So I go back out and he said, well, did you look it over? And I said, yeah. And he says, what do you think? And I said, well, I still don't know yet. I looked at the book, but it's really hard to know what I'd be doing if I joined the Army Security Agency. So what kind of work does it do? And the guy looks at me and said, I can't tell you. And what? How am I supposed to decide? However, that kind of answer sort of like set the hook a little bit. Wow, they're really secret. Now, I didn't know until later that the Army Security Agency was the Army branch of the National Security Agency. And as we all know by now, the National Security is engaged in communications intercept. So if he had said that would, but that was back then when nobody actually knew very much what the National Security Agency was. So he said, well, anyway, here's a letter for your recruiter. And he gave me an envelope, a regular envelope. And he says, take this back to your recruiter and give it to him and tell him what your final decision is. And if you decide against joining the Army Security Agency, forget you ever had this conversation. And I thought, wow, this is quite an organization. So I went straight back from the testing center to my recruiter's office, and he said, yeah, how did it go? And I said, well, they said to give you this. I give him this envelope, and he opens it up, and he looks at it, and he goes, oh, my God, this is fantastic. He says, I only get 2 or 3 people a year who get a chance to join this Army Security Agency. He says, this is great. You got to join. You got to join. And I said, what, really? And he says, yeah. He says, they give you training, they send you to school, and the duty stations are really great and the work is really wonderful. And I said, well, what do they do? And he said, well, I really don't know. So it's one of these things, So me, only thinking I want to be a cop, I said, well, can I be an MP if I join the Army Security Agency? And he said, sure, yeah. I found out that was BS, but I can tell you about that in a future episode sometime. But he said, sure, yeah, you could be a cop. And I said, yeah, okay, maybe it might be worth it. And he says, but there's one kicker. And I said, well, what's that? And he said, well, Army Security Agency enlistment is 4 years. I said, wow, 4 years. That's a long time. And he said, yeah, but the first year is actually school and training. So your actually tour of duty is 3 years. And like I said, you go, and it's really valuable and it's good education and stuff like that. So I said, oh, okay, I thought it over for a while and I decided to pull the trigger, and I did it. And I gave up on the University of Illinois, especially since I thought the Army Security Agency was going to make me a copper. And I enlisted for the 4 years, and I got my assignment. And from there, they started doing my background check, which was okay. So there was no problem there. But once I joined up, the first place they sent me was to Fort Leonard Wood, Missouri. Now, Fort Leonard Wood, Missouri was for my basic combat training. And every GI had to go through basic combat training, no matter what they would be doing in the future. And it was rough. It was tough. It was just like you see in the movies, the guys were screaming and yelling and profanity and making you do all kinds of tiresome stuff and jump out of bed in the middle of the night and carry a big pack for miles and miles, camp out, do a belly crawl under live fire machine guns, throwing hand. It was a gas, man. It was so much fun. And it made me really fit. It was the most fit I had ever been in my life. And it's probably the most fit I will ever be in my life. I'm sure that applies now. But after that, I went over to Fort Devens, Massachusetts to start my Army Security Agency training. Now, they got me out of the idea of becoming an MP, a little bit underhanded, but they said, you don't want to be an MP in the Army Security Agency, because an MP in the Army Security Agency is basically a gate guard who checks everybody's ID when they come in through the gate. You don't want to do that. You got to go into these other jobs that are much more challenging and much more valuable for your future. So I took a couple of more tests, and they assigned me to code analyst, cryptanalyst. And so that means basically being a code breaker. So I got to Fort Devens to go into Crippy school. But the problem was that a Crippy class had just begun. And they only had like 2 a year or something like that. So they said the next one's not going to start for 6 months. So you got to sort of like wait around for 6 months for your school. Well, I said, okay, what do I do until then? And I'll tell you, the Army will always find something for you to do. I ended up being a real slave. I was shoveling snow in the wintertime. I was washing dishes. I was firing a coal fire furnace. I was driving a 2.5-ton truck. Yeah, it was really, really hard work. It was interesting in a way because I was doing a lot of things that I never would have done as a civilian, but it was hard work. They worked you really, really hard, especially the KP, the kitchen police job. But one day this guy came in and he asked me, do you play a musical instrument? And I said, yep. And he said, do you have a musical instrument at home? And I said, yep. And they said, can they send it? And I said, yep. And he says, boy, you just became a member of the band. So they moved me out of the general worker barracks into the band barracks, which were beautiful. And I spent my next close to 6 months as a band member, marching in the streets of Boston. That also was a lot of fun. At the same time, I'm going to Crippy school. It finally got started. And as I said at the time, I was a smart mouth baby boomer, and I never missed a chance to mouth off to people of authority and adults and things like that. And I'll tell you what, mouthing off to people of authority does not work very well in the military. And my head teacher, Sergeant Barber, ended up hating me. And for good reason. I'll say that for good reason. Just about every time he talked to me, I had something to say back, and which I thought was really cute. Sergeant Barber, unfortunately, didn't share my opinion on that. So when it got to the end of the class and it was time to submit what we called our dream sheet for our next assignment, I asked for Korea. I hadn't, gotten the Japan bug quite yet. quite entirely. So I said, Korea, I want to go to Korea. So I submitted my dream sheet, and I don't know for sure, and I can't say 100%, but I think Sergeant Barber put a word in with the assignment guy and told him, this guy's a real smart aleck. Give him the worst duty assignment you can give him, especially if it's Vietnam. But unfortunately, my brother was already in Vietnam. And so they had a policy at that time, no blood brothers in Vietnam at the same time. I guess they didn't want any Saving Private Ryan situation to occur again. So they asked me, you can't go to Vietnam because your brother's there. If you want, you can like change places. And oh, no, that's all right. He's already there, and no use in making things more difficult than what they are. So they sent me to the second worst place that you could imagine, and that was to Shemya, Alaska. Now, the first time I heard of Shemya, Alaska, my reaction was, where the heck is that? And so I asked a guy, an older guy, and I said, hey, man, what do you know about Shemya? He says, it's the best place, best duty assignment in the world. And I said, really? Why? And he says, there's a girl behind every tree. And I said, wow, that sounds good. Later, I'd find out there are no trees on Shemya. Shemya is 2 miles wide, 4 miles long, and consists of rock, tundra grass, snow, and ice, period. No trees, no mountains, no hills to speak of. And it's like up on this plateau. It's a volcanic island out on the Aleutian chain, out at the end, near the end of the Aleutian chain, closer to the USSR at that time than it was to the American mainland. And there's nobody there but GIs, all male GIs at the time. And so it was a pretty desolate place. Now, the good thing about it was the work. The work was really, 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 really interesting because it was the front line of the Cold War. Off duty time, when you had your free time, not so much. There was nothing to do unless you were, there was a gym, you could shoot baskets. There was a bowling alley. There was a movie theater. And there was a club where you could drink, which took up quite a bit of time. But anyway, it was a bad place to be, but it was going there that triggered my coming to Japan. While I was there, I met up with a guy who was a little bit older than I was, who had just come to Shemya from Japan. And I think he might have been to Japan twice or something like that. And he had nothing but good things to say. He used to rave about it. And he used to tell me these stories about what a wonderful place it was. What you have to do, what you better not do, what you should do, what you shouldn't do, what's a waste of time, and all this kind of stuff. And it was through his tutelage that I started really getting excited about going to Japan. So he told me, and I remember his name too. His name is Jim Keyes, right? He's from Oklahoma. And Jim, I hope you hear this sometimes because I have a big debt of gratitude that I owe you. If it wasn't for you, my life would have been very different. But anyway, what happened was I go in, when my time in Shemya came to an end, I went in to submit my dream sheet again. So I go in there and they said, well, where do you want to go, son? I said, I want to go to Japan. They said, okay, Japan. So in your kind of work that you can do, we only have 2 bases. At that time, there were bases all across Japan still. But he says, you only can go to either one of 2 bases. And I says, which are those? And he said, Chitose or Hakata. Now, I didn't know it at the time, but Chitose is located on the island, Japanese island of Hokkaido, which is the northernmost island in Japan, which in the wintertime is very cold, very snowy, and not that much different from Shemya, except maybe that there are more non-military people running around and that there are towns where you can do normal human things. However, I didn't know that at that time. So I'm sitting there and I have to make a decision and I'm knowing nothing. So I only had to, the only thing I had to go back on was the limited knowledge I had of my current environment. So they said, well, son, where do you want to go? And I said, which one is warmer? And they said, Hakata. So I said, that's it. I'm going to Hakata. So that's where they put me. That's where they assigned me for my next duty assignment. Little did I know that by going to Hakata, that would trigger my love for Japan. It would be one of the main reasons that I stayed here. I lived in Fukuoka for a number of years after getting out of the Army. I was teaching English, and that it was during the time that I was teaching English that I met this wonderful, cute girl who eventually became my wife and is still my wife until this very day. So thank you, Jim Keyes, and thank you, U.S. Army. Okay, so after getting through with Alaska, after finishing my Alaska tour, I went back home to Chicago for about 40 days, took a 40-day vacation. I saved virtually my entire paycheck for 15 months in Alaska. And in Chicago, I spent almost all of it. You know, I leased a car and went out every night. Yeah, it was a lot of fun. But then it was time to get back. So that my next stop after taking my leave was to go to Oakland Army Base. Now, I don't know the way it is now. Back in those days, the military moved their troops to like staging points or staging bases. Like when I went to Alaska, I went from Chicago, I went to Fort Lewis, Washington to Elmendorf Air Force Base, Elmendorf Air Force Base to Shemya. And this was because they would gather enough people to fill an airplane or all the available seats in an airplane, assign the people, they get on the plane and go. So I arrived in Oakland, and Oakland was a real circus. They had these big, giant warehouses, humongous things filled with GIs on the way to Vietnam. There were bunks. I don't remember if they were single bunks or bunk beds or what, but they were just guys lined up row after row after row, just waiting for their airplane to go to Vietnam. I was a little bit lucky since I wasn't going to Vietnam. I had a little bit more of a private place where I was, and I was a little bit ranked higher than I was when I went to Alaska. So I didn't have to do any of those grunt jobs. I got to do like clerical kind of things. But I was there for about a week. And after about a week, we all, everybody went out to this airplane. Now, the airplanes, there were no jumbo jets back in those days. I don't remember the type of airplane we got on, but it was big for its day. And what the United States military would do is they would lease the airplane and have the inside, all the amenities of the inside were stripped out. I mean, down to bare bones. And they packed as many seats as physically possible into the plane. So you get on this plane and your shoulders are physically rubbing against the shoulders of the guy in the seat next to you. And your knees are bumping up against the seat in front of you, packed full of soldiers, young guys about my age. So this thing finally takes off, and I'm on my way across the Pacific. So the plane eventually flew into Yokota Air Base, which is in Western Japan, and touched down. And you know how usually after the plane goes up to the terminal building, they open the doors and everybody gets up, starts getting their stuff, and there's this hustle and bustle. It takes a long time to file off the plane. Not in this case. When the airplane stopped at the terminal and the doors opened, only 5 people got off. Everybody else stayed on the airplane. And all 5 people were Army Security Agency people. So we got off the plane, and there were 5 people at the terminal who got on the plane. So there were 5 people going from Japan into Vietnam. And that was the next stop for that airplane. I think the next stop was Vietnam, might have been the Philippines. I don't know. But eventually, the last stop was Vietnam. And as I can remember very clearly as I got to the bottom of the stairs and I turned around and started thinking about that, I started wondering, I wonder how many of these guys ever made it back, or how many never made it back. And, I hope for the best of them, I hope that they did make it back, but you never know. And so we were very lucky to get off where we did. So from there, Yokota became my next staging area. So I had to spend another week. I was finally here. My feet were finally standing on Japanese soil, but only kind of, because even though I was technically in Japan, I was on a U.S. Air Force base, and those of you who have been on Army bases overseas know that they're generally like taking a chunk of America and setting them down inside of another country. There are flavors of the host country. There was some Japanese kind of things, accents to the base, but no real, this is Japan kind of flavor yet. I wouldn't get that until the first time I went out the front gate of the base and see what Japan had in store for me. Okay, that will be it for today. And again, I want to thank you, all the subscribers who have subscribed, all the viewers who are viewing. And the next episode, I'll be telling you about what happened when I walked off the base for the first time, what my first impressions and feelings of Japan were, and if what Jim Keyes told me in Shemya turned out to be true or not. As the message says across the bottom of the screen here, I'm going to quote Clinton Jaws one more time. Please subscribe. It's the only thing I think about. It's the only thing I want in this life, right? So right now, with our small number of subscribers, we're just having fun here. It would be really great if we could start generating a little bit more YouTube interest. Hope the channel gets bigger. Then if it does get bigger, I'll be able to invest more in equipment, good imaging and things like that, maybe do some live streams and things like that. And that's all in the future. So in the meantime, hang in there. I hope you stick with us, and I'll see you next time when I'll bring you another story about what it's been like living in Japan. See you then.